To the monthly offerings of the Wagner Society of New York. My name is Peter Phillips, and I have the honor to serve as the president of the society. Before we hear from the professor, I just want to remind everybody that in May, on Friday, the 22nd of May, the final auditions will be held for the Lauch and Springer Awards to young Wagnerians. This used to be a process that was private and intimate. And in the last few years, we decided to share the excitement with our members. It's going to be at 2 p.m. on the 22nd of May. You're absolutely welcome to come and watch these 12, really deeply promising and talented singers, and join the esteemed judges panel from our singers committee in what promises to be a very exciting afternoon. There's no admission charged, but it's sort of expected that people who attend will please drop $5 into the Singers Fund in order to make sure that the endowment that maintains our singers grants stays dynamic and keeps growing. More information is on the website under Singers. We're also going to wrap up this season by a showing of a wonderful documentary by Helen Warshaw, a good friend for many years of the Wagner Society, on Mahler in New York. And that will be held at the Dolby Theater in Midtown. Again, I recommend that you just go on the website to find out how to reserve a seat for that. It's going to be a limited seating if you guys have been to the Dolby before. So if you're interested in seeing that documentary and meeting Helen, I encourage you to hop on and do that. Finally, our activities in Bayreuth. For those of you who are fortunate enough to be able to come to Bayreuth, our membership seems to be spread over different times during the festival. So our very, very hardworking volunteer, Jillian Murray, is arranging for dinners and for artist talks and for all kinds of things throughout that period. And those of you who are going to Bayreuth, please do stay in touch on the website. Jillian is with us, and I want to make sure that I acknowledge the extraordinary work that she does for the society in so many different ways. She's a very, very, very valued member. Those of you who are inclined to help us on a volunteer basis, please. We're getting bigger and bigger, and our bandwidth needs are getting wider and wider, and we really need all the help we can get. You know how to get a hold of me at info@WagnerSocietyNY.org, and anything you could do to help. It's a very gratifying task. I think that's it. It's my honor to introduce Professor Josh Barth.
Thank you so much, and it is fabulous to be with you this evening. Greetings to those of you watching the live stream or the recording after. Quick disclaimer, my students call me made of springs and Red Bull. So if I start talking too fast, if I get too excited, please just let me know by raising your hand and I will adjust the approach accordingly. I want to begin with two quick anecdotes. One, to introduce myself to you all, and then the second, getting to the heart at what we are talking about this evening, the artistic foundations of Wagner. I fell in love with Wagner when I was 19. My brother had a Fulbright scholarship in Bonn, Germany, so being a dutiful family who saw an opportunity, we went over during the holiday season in order to visit him. And despite all all of our best efforts, we forgot or didn't realize that everything was closed during the week between Christmas and New Year's, so we had to adjust our plans accordingly. We ended up getting to Vienna about 2 days earlier than expected. And when this happened, I found myself 19, jeans and a t-shirt, hanging out in the lobby of the Staatsoper, not knowing what to do. I went up for a rush ticket, and the woman looked at me like I was crazy and said, "No, there are no rush tickets. What are you trying to do?" Well, after the opera started, and I was a freshman at the University of Michigan in vocal performance, but was really new to opera, a woman dressed in all of her Viennese glory with furs and jewels comes down the steps and says, "I'm not feeling well, here's my ticket." And I was like, great. So I abandoned my family. They weren't too keen on it. Again, 19-year-old, just like wreaking havoc in the Staatsoper. But I take it, and I ended up in one of the central boxes, center. Everyone around me was wearing, suits worth thousands of euros for opening night of a new production of Götterdämmerung. I mention this because for then the next 6 hours, I was on the absolute edge of my seat. And I like to tell this story for a couple of reasons. First of all, it gives you a sense of me as a person that I just randomly end up in Götterdämmerung and I'm all in. My personality in a nutshell. But also, I think it's important when we start talks like this to remember that we come to these kinds of talks, or one of the reasons that we come to these kinds of talks is because of the joy of sitting in the theater and having that experience. The point here, hopefully I teach you some things, hopefully you learn some things, hopefully you get a new perspective through which you can look and listen to the fabulous operas and music dramas of Richard Wagner, but also you remember why you first fell in love with this in the first place, that this is about getting more out of the theater, not just filling our brains with more facts. And I think that's an important distinction as we move forward. The rest of our time, about an hour or so, allowing some time for questions, is really an invitation. It is an invitation in order to think about Wagner from maybe a different perspective. This is going to be a 20,000-foot talk, not a detailed talk, if that makes sense. So we're not going to, talk about a specific word and track that through, or a specific chord or something like that. We're instead going to talk about a kind of paradigm shift that I think is interesting and I think is warranted. In order to do that, I want to now turn my attention to my second anecdote, if you will. I found myself at the Metropolitan Museum of Art a number of years ago when there was a big Delacroix exhibition. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may remember that. It was a fabulous retrospective. And I love that, I'm a Wagner fan. I'm a 19th century art guy. So I was just over the moon about it. But there were two paintings that made me cry and made me really think in a different way. And they are here, and these were my pictures of them. You can find them on the internet, in greater high def. But we have two images that were not meant to be a diptych. You were not meant to see these two pictures together. But we have the same subject. We have the agony of the garden. So this is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, going through that dark night of the soul, if you will. Here on the left, you have a monumental painting. Notice the little girl who's standing in front here, gives you a sense of scale. This is one of the earliest paintings that was in this exhibition of the agony of the garden. And it's wonderful, and it's filled with emotion and color and light and objects and all of these things. Here on the right is one of the last pictures that was in the exhibition from the very, very end of Delacroix's life. And we have the same subject. And this painting is like 12 inches by 12 inches. It is very small. I would call it distilled. You almost don't even realize that it's, Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's so kind of pared down and muted, and represents an artist at the end of his life. And I think by looking at these two paintings, again, he didn't expect they would be hanging near each other, we learn about the human that was this artist. That I think by seeing these two, I was so touched and moved by seeing the old and the new and the new and the old. And it got me thinking, I'd always been interested in the beginnings and ends of artists' lives. I love early Verdi, the Nabuccos and even earlier, and I love Falstaff. And I think knowing Nabucco helps you appreciate Falstaff and vice versa. Beethoven's symphonies, most famously, we listen to all 9, 3, 5, 7, 9, get almost equal play depending on the season of the symphony concert, early Mozart versus mature Mozart. You just could keep going on. We love Sondheim's Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and we love Passion. We get the entire scope of an artist's life, and that is one of the things that we enjoy. Strangely, and part of this was his fault, we don't do this for Wagner at all. Wagner, in almost all of the scholarship and in all of the public discourse, is almost exclusively concerned with this. Exclusively concerned with the very end, once you get into the music dramas, and even more interestingly to me, even past this, the legacy of Wagner is what we are so, and rightfully, concerned with and find interesting. It's fascinating how these ideas influenced other artists, how these ideas were co-opted, how these ideas shifted and changed based on where they ended up, not taking away from the discussion of Wagner's legacy or the importance of grappling with that legacy. But that's all after 1883, after he died. And it's fascinating that he's one of the only major artists where we don't afford this kind of retrospective. And so, in an interest of humanizing Wagner, of demythologizing, if you will, his output and his thoughts and all of those things, I think that we need to spend a little more time over here. I think we need to spend a little more time at what made this person who he was, what his earliest operas reveal, and tantalizingly, where did those come from? How did those ideas come about? And then how did those ideas shift and change? So that leads me to my central thesis, albeit through a little bit of a roundabout discussion of what we are doing here. By the way, here's my husband and I at Bayreuth in 2023, and it's very fitting that we're having this conversation before we head into the 150th anniversary this summer, which of course has the first time that Rienzi is being performed in the Festspielhaus. So we see even the Bayreuth Festival celebrating and exploring this earlier work in a new and interesting way. Just to sum up and recap, we have here, unlike most other major artists, I would say almost unlike every other major artist, scholarship and interest overwhelmingly favors Wagner's legacy, often focusing on the events and influences well past his death. However, to reframe, recontextualize, and humanize Wagner with all his failings, blind spots, and more attention must be paid to the richness of his early life, the world in which he inhabited, and the dialogue between old and new. One of the things that I think is interesting, I just directed a production of The Flying Dutchman this past summer at Des Moines Metro Opera with Ryan McKinney as the Dutchman, and I'm older than Wagner was when he wrote The Dutchman. I'm starting to get up there, my hairline is receding, but, I don't think we visualize him that way. We don't visualize him as this young whippersnapper with his shoes, kind of falling apart as he goes through the streets of Paris on fire about art. That's just not the image that we get in an interesting way, and it should be based on the piece that we are exploring. It's also interesting, the more that you dive into early Wagner, both his writings and his influences, we realize that not everything he did was revolutionary, and that's okay. In fact, it makes what is revolutionary, it makes what is new, what was so exciting to audiences at his time and beyond, mean even more. We see him breaking out of the mold, which is very different than just assuming that it's a whole new mold to begin with. This approach helps us better hear, see, and enjoy Wagner productions when they occur live in front of us or on recordings or wherever you most enjoy this music and drama. I want to give you an example of how this way of thinking informs the way to better experience, enjoy, and create Wagner. So I mentioned that I directed this production of The Flying Dutchman, and as I was considering how to stage it and how to put it together, which is very different than being an audience member, I was having one heck of a time with the staging of the Dallant Dutchman duet in Act 1. It is, love it, but it's interminable. Like, it goes on for a really long time, and you have Dallant and the Dutchman talking about money. It just kind of wanders and goes on, and essentially, in my mind, there were only two ways of thinking about this. And in talking to friends and scholars in this repertoire, there were essentially kind of two camps. Either you say, well, he was a young man and didn't know what he was doing, and yeah, it's poorly paced, but like, you have to put up with it. Or there is great meaning in it, that if you just read the tea leaves right, you'll understand what's happening in that duet. However, I found myself at the Met in their most recent revival of Fidelio, and suddenly in front of me, I see this duet between Don Pizarro and Rocco in Act 1 as they go on and on about money. Oh, this is a convention. There was a third way of thinking about it. It's not he was, a child and didn't know what he was doing, or it's revolutionary and you're not smart enough to understand it. He was following a convention of the time. A convention we can even trace back in Rossini's The Barber of Seville to Figaro and the Count talking about money in Act 1. We see these duets about men dealing with the big issues of their lives, which in this case of the 19th century was money, going through these almost bel canto duets. And by digging into the convention, into seeing how Wagner is using those in his music at that time, allowed me as a director to help the audience better understand what was happening. And with Ryan McKinney, we talked about how he goes from his big monologue in the earlier scene to then entering the banality and the conventionality of the world of Dallant. And that duet came alive in a different way by saying, this is a convention, this is a part of the world in which Wagner found himself, and that's okay, just as it's okay for Verdi to write a bel canto structured aria. Same idea, and allows us to, again, not be stuck in this dichotomy of it's terrible or it's genius. There is a third way, and it's that he was a human writing in a specific time and place. So, as I started to look into the foundations of Wagner and into kind of thinking about this new way of considering the juvenilia and the early life of this artist, the first place I went was his autobiography, Mein Leben, My Life. Who here has read it? Oh, great, just a handful of people. Great, okay, good. I was very concerned that every hand would go up and the rest of the hour would essentially be useless. No, that's awesome. I went to Mein Leben for a couple of reasons. First, as I was going through various Wagner scholarship, I realized that we take what everyone says about Wagner 100% literally. But anything that he says about himself, we're like, well, that's not true, or that hasn't been substantiated, or he was exaggerating. But actually, I think that's a bit of a mistake, because the way that we tell our stories deeply matters. Anyone who's had a conversation with an older family member telling stories of their youth, does it matter if that story is 100% factual? No. The way that that person tells their story is as important as the facts themselves. If we were writing a scholarly, peer-reviewed, book or article, of course, the literal truth of the facts would matter on a very, very deep level. But again, we're here as audience members trying to get at the heart of who this person was, and so reading their version of the truth is sometimes even more important and more interesting to the enjoyment of the art. To give you another parallel, the autobiography of Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's collaborator, is a complete and utter fiction. I don't care. It is a great read, and the way that he exaggerates and talks about his life matters deeply to understanding what it must have been like to be with this person at a dinner party. And that is ultimately what we're trying to do here. So I went to the source. I went to how he told his life in this great book. A little bit of history about this very controversial autobiography. It started in 1865 when he was asked by King Ludwig to write an account of his life. This was originally a very private endeavor. Part 1 would be published in 1870, and it was all dictated by Cosima. And over time, people, have found factual errors in it, and, I think that's perfectly valid. I'm sure if I went back to Vienna and it took the image that I had in my memory of what that lobby looked like when I got that ticket for Götterdämmerung and what it actually looks like, might be a little different, right? There's always that little bit of disconnect. But I think it's interesting that Cosima later tried to gather all of the copies of Mein Leben and destroy them, which to me says there's more truth in it than not, right? If she was afraid of how self-revealing it was, if it was all mythology, then she would be like pumping that out there, right? But she wasn't. She tried to burn them, which says that actually there might be something to this work. Eventually, part 4 would be published in 1880, notice 3 years before he died. So the fourth part doesn't, take us all the way through to the end of his life. Was first published for public consumption in 1911. And then, you can follow from here. And the translation that I will be using as we go through the rest of our time together is this one. By Andrew Gray in 1983. Originally was published without an index, which is fascinating. This is just a work that just hasn't really kind of caught on in the same way as many others. So I fully acknowledge that there are probably factual errors. There's certainly an agenda, but there's always an agenda. We're people. Any email I write to my boss has an agenda. And I think that's important to consider as we go through. Here's what Wagner said about Mein Leben. The contents of these volumes have been written down directly from my dictation over a period of several years by my friend and wife who wished me to tell her the story of my life. It was the desire of both of us that these details of my life should be accessible to our family and to our sincere and trusted friends. There were only 11 copies of this in full that were first set out before the public publication. Where was I? I'd have some at our own expense, as the value of this autobiography consists in its unadorned veracity, which, under the circumstances and its only justification, therefore my statements had to be accompanied by precise names and dates. Hence, there could be no question of their publication until some time after my death, should interest in them still survive in our descendants, and on that point I intend leaving directions in my will. If, on the other hand, we do not refuse certain intimate friends a sight of these papers now, it is that, relying on their genuine interest in the contents, we are confident that they will not pass on their knowledge to any who do not share their feelings in the matter. So essentially, do not let this get into the hand of my artistic enemies. Don't make my life any more difficult, is what that means. And what I think is immediately striking about this is that what we have here is a convention. Anyone who has read any autobiography ever by the most megalomaniac or the most humble people, the preface is going to be the same. Oh, I just jotted down some thoughts. Don't worry about it. I don't know how brilliant it is. Oh, maybe. That's a convention. And it helps us understand that he understands what he's doing in surprising ways. The rest of our time together is going to deal almost exclusively, or I should say exclusively, with the first part of Mein Leben and the artistic influences mentioned therein. The first part takes us up to his return to Dresden after his disastrous time in Paris. Rienzi has not premiered yet. He has not made it big in any way. And that is the first part of this autobiography. And there we have him as a young man. This is a picture I took in the Wagner Museum in Bayreuth. And this is, interestingly, how we should think about him for the rest of the evening. Very optimistic, kind of, young and boyish in all of those ways that we don't associate with Wagner often. And a couple of things in reading this work that immediately stuck out to me and surprised me. First, it's really funny. How many of us think of funny the first time we think of Richard Wagner? No, he, later in life, and when you read his prose works and even his, critical reviews that he wrote, as a young man or what have you, he's very serious. But yet, in telling the story of his life, he's quite funny and even more surprising, self-deprecating. He is constantly saying, I had no idea what I was doing. Which is so surprising, because in all of his prose works, he says what? I know exactly what I'm doing. So there's something about the older man reflecting on his youth that he says, maybe I didn't have it all figured out. Maybe I didn't have it right. Richard Wagner, as a young man, and I would assert throughout his entire life, had a difficulty learning. He had a really hard time at school. He had a really hard time in piano lessons. He had a really hard time in college. And he had a really hard time being a young professional. I do not ascribe to any kind of diagnosis of somebody, posthumously or especially from a different time. But you can't help reading the first part of Mein Leben and say, this guy has really severe ADHD. You could just imagine him as an 8-year-old talking about how he couldn't sit still and he's looking out the window and he's flitting around from different subjects and he can't seem to find anything that grabs his attention for longer than 5 minutes. And we all know, or maybe in my case are, that kid. And I think it's interesting that when we look at how he later created so many innovative things and brought together so many things, that he took this difficulty of learning and pushed through it and ended up allowing his kind of dabbling in everything that accompanies his childhood to be the superpower by which he brings everything together in his works. That ends up being the linchpin, if you will, of what makes his music and drama so fascinating. He was intensely influenced by those around him. And again, this gets to my central thesis of why it's important to know who influenced him. And he mentions it. He says his great political awakening happened in Leipzig, and there was a student riot over something, and he had no idea what it was, but he was so caught up in the energy and the passion that he was right there with him. He was somebody who, if you were passionate about it, he would join you. And sometimes that led him incredibly into contradictory directions, which is one of the things that makes him so frustrating and so human, is that he would be so easily influenced by those around him, which again is not a quality that we often associate with Richard Wagner, particularly in his maturity. He's someone who influences others. He is not someone who is influenced by people. He also had grand ambitions from the outset. As a young child, he was all or nothing. He was either writing a play or writing nothing at all. He was not one to write a little sonnet. He had this ambition, this kind of totality within him from a very young age, which I think is interesting. I think that's a really interesting character trait that he has. Then final two, he was a man of the theater. We'll talk about this more in just a second, but he was not a man of music first. He had music surrounding him. He knew Der Freischütz at a very young age. He knew Fidelio. He knew all of these pieces, but his upbringing was in the theater. He was a child actor. He was raised essentially backstage at theaters, and he tells great anecdotes in Mein Leben of trying to use the late curtain of a play that he was in the night before to get out of going to school the next day. I don't know if anyone had, if you were all actors as kids or whatever, you'd be like, oh, Mom, that curtain ended at 10. I can't possibly make the bus. That was the young Wagner. He was a man of the theater and came to composition, came to piano lessons very late, especially in 19th century great composer terms. He is a person of the theater who happened to be a brilliant composer. And I think that is an incredible paradigm shift. I hear it all the time from Wagner fans. Oh, I love the music. The poetry and the drama, maybe is a little less brilliant, but the music. But in order to actually understand Wagner, the man, we gotta flip that. And we have to say his poetry and drama is the most important thing. And yet he had these special abilities with composition that no one else did. Right? He came to it late, therefore he didn't get all of the rules, which meant it was easier for him to break them. I'm not saying that you can't love the music over the poetry, be frustrated by the monologues in Tristan, or whatever your hang-up might be, but he was a man of the theater first. And then finally, And arguably the most surprising thing about Mein Leben is he's relatively fair to those around him. Meyerbeer, for example, gets a lot of compliments in Mein Leben, which I think is fascinating, since Wagner did great injustices to Meyerbeer's legacy moving forward. And yet, he talks about how generous Meyerbeer was as a young man to him. He talks about being influenced by him, and there is a softness here that is absolutely fascinating when we consider who actually was this person, warts and all. So, I want to take a quick pause here and just quickly mention some of the biographical details that comprise Wagner's early life. Some of this you may know. It's just simply, the timeline of his life and, any Wagner biography you might come across, but also is not as famous as some of the things that happened later. He was born, as we know, in 1813, same year as Verdi, in war-torn Germanic lands. And I don't say Germany because it didn't exist in any kind of political entity, but he's born in war. In fact, fascinatingly, his father died very soon after his birth, and his mother, in going through war-torn Leipzig, traveled with the young child to meet the man who will eventually be Wagner's stepfather, Ludwig Geyer, who very possibly was also his biological father as well. We'll never really know. His mother, Johanna, left, that kind of unresolved, much to Wagner's dismay when she died. So we don't ever have concrete proof, but very possibly that was the real father of Richard. The family, as soon as mourning laws were reached, she married Ludwig Geyer and they moved to Dresden. Ludwig Geyer was an actor, and a very good one, apparently. So when we say he was a man of the theater, he was literally in the theater. His stepfather was going to the theater almost every single night as we moved through. And it's also worth noting that Wagner's presumed, or at least, early in his life, biological father was also an interesting man of the theater. He had a bureaucratic job, kind of as a policeman, but yet was always going to plays by Schiller, always going to plays by Goethe. He was absolutely in that world as well. Wagner's sisters ended up being very prominent actresses of the time. He was surrounded by theater. The first things that he saw were Schiller and Goethe and Shakespeare. That was at the heart of it. Now, it's worth noting that there also was composers around, and in fact, Ludwig Geyer was a dear friend of Carl Maria von Weber. So young Wagner met him at dinner parties, which is also kind of interesting. So when we say that there are Weber influences in Wagner, we're not just talking about some kind of German lineage. This is the guy who sat at the dinner table, right? Which is a whole different way of thinking about how these harmonies and how this romanticism seeps into his work. Eventually, after a difficult childhood in terms of his education, he enrolls in the University of Leipzig for music. And as he describes it, this was essentially on a whim. He was not a very good piano student. He was not a great composition student. He was equally interested in theater and classics and all kinds of things, but happened to just major in music, which I think is, again, very interesting. And he eventually becomes the chorus master in Würzburg in 1833, and then he writes his first full opera, The Fairies, De Fine. And he moves to Magdeburg, which is then when he meets his first wife, Minna Plenner, who is an actress, again, man of the theater, and they get increasingly in more debt. He marries her in 1836, where he writes his second opera, full opera, I should say, Das Liebesverbot, The Forbidden Love, which is based largely on Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. And if I could revive any Wagner production right now, it would be that. It's fabulous. It's so interesting and so unknown by even those of us who are in the heart of the Wagnerian world. He eventually, in that year, marries Minna, and he takes his position in Riga, moving further and further away from home. And I think that's important to remember about Wagner's early biography. Again, his operas haven't really seen the light of day. They've received only a handful of performances at this point. He is a working chorus master. He's a working pianist. He's a working musician trying to make it work in a world where there was no board to ensure that you were paid. Wagner was very bad with money, we all know that, but he also was being coming of age in a theatrical ecosystem that had no safety net. You were told you will be paid by the end of the season, and sometimes you weren't. So what are you supposed to do, right? Which is important as we go through. Riga, it's worth noting, is also as far away from the rest of Wagner's world as you can possibly imagine. Here is a picture of Wagner's kind of world from the beginning of Mein Leben. It's worth noting you have in the center, you have Leipzig, you have Dresden, you have Prague, you have the world of Wagner. And if you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, it says Riga with an arrow. On a map of Wagner's life, on a map of Wagner's world, Riga doesn't even make it. It is that far removed. And I think that's pretty interesting as we think about his frustrations and how that grows throughout. He then escapes famously in the middle of the night due to debtors and almost going to prison for it with Minna and their Newfoundland dog, Baron. And it's worth noting in Paris, when Baron disappears, like it's one of the most heartbreaking paragraphs I've ever read in an autobiography is him talking about losing the dog. It's really sad and really, really human. He then goes to Paris in 1839, which is an absolute disaster, but foundational to his work as an artist. And in 1842, at the end of part one, he then returns to Dresden, where his fortunes are all about to change. Notice here, he's not even to his 30th birthday in that entire history, and yet so much has happened that is going to shape everything that follows. We also have to remember that there were many things that are happening in Wagner's world around him, many cross-currents that are going to be important in the works that he first writes and in the works of his later life. We, of course, have the Romantic movement. Wagner is, walking through Dresden, which is kind of the heart of Romantic painting during this period. He's absorbing all of this. The Young Germany movement, a kind of proto-hippie, free love-ish movement that was happening that Wagner was absolutely a part of. And in fact, Das Liebesverbot is kind of a young Germany manifesto, if you will, on the values of breaking out of conventional ways of living. We, of course, have the Industrial Revolution. I think it's really important to note that Wagner, in the first part of Mein Leben, talks almost exclusively about walking to Prague. But that by the time he's, middle-aged, he's taking trains everywhere. Like, the world is rapidly shifting. And his interest in technology, I think, is borne out by the fact that he's coming of age in one of the most rapidly changing worlds until we get to the 20th century and the 21st. And I think that's important to keep in mind. The rise of nationalism, of course, we're talking about 19th century nationalism here, the idea of nations existing and nations being connected to the people who live there, not just what ruler happens to be in charge of you. And he is following the trends of German theater. Quick side note about that. German theaters in this time were very provincial. They were very underfunded despite the theatrical ambitions of people like Schiller and Goethe and others in the Romantics. And they also blended genres in a way that I think is important for us to remember. Many German houses actually do this to this day, but you'll have musicals and plays and operas performed by the same company. And that was true in Wagner's time as well. So when he was chorus master in Würzburg and in Magdeburg and eventually in Riga, he was not only the chorus master of operas, he was also dealing with Singspiel and with other forms of early operetta. He's dealing with French pieces, he's dealing with plays, he's dealing with all of it. He knew all of it, and he was a part of all of it. And so I think it's worth noting that the first major composer to write his own libretti and to conceive of the idea of a music drama came of age in a theatrical ecosystem that was falling apart and that had no genre distinctions in the practical realities of putting together a theatrical season. He also talks about meeting a number of people in his youth. Again, we're dealing with all of the people he met up to his 30th birthday. And look at this. We already mentioned the dinner parties that happened with Carl Maria von Weber. Laube and Heine, two major prominent parts of the Young Germany movement, who are so important. Of course, Heine's work will eventually inspire the plot of The Flying Dutchman. And then notice all these French composers. Albert, Meyerbeer, met them, hung out with them, had frustrating relations with them sometimes. Olivier and Berlioz. He not only knew this music, but he was like sitting across from them. He was frustrated sometimes by their personalities not matching up with their brilliance, or in the case of Olivier, the opposite. He's like, how are you so boring as a person, and yet your music is so interesting? Why aren't you more interesting? He was kind of frustrated by that dichotomy, which is really kind of charming and interesting as it moves forward. So, that gives you just a taste of his biographical sketch, of some ways that he thought about his early life, and possibly, and in looking at your faces, I think kind of some surprising anecdotes as we move forward. For the sake of time, I'm now going to move to the heart of our talk, which is something that, to my knowledge, isn't really available to public consumption. If I can have some volunteers help me with this. Your party favor, if you will, is I have gone through the entirety of part 1 of Mein Leben and noted every single work of art that is mentioned. And this is yours to have. And if you're watching this online, we'll figure out a way to get this to you through a shareable link. But again, in Wagner scholarship and talking about Wagner, we kind of shy away from saying, wow, that sounds like Berlioz, or something like that. But here you have every work of art. Poetry, plays, again, man of the theater, operas, of course. It's worth noting that when he was in Paris, one of the ways that he was able to put a modest amount of food on the table was by creating piano reductions of operas. So he had almost 200 operas in his library that he was noting by hand. Anybody a composer in the room? No? One of the things that often will happen early in a composer's life is they will, transcribe Beethoven symphonies. You learn about orchestration by taking your hand and going from the woodwinds down to the strings and then really down into, wherever it might be. Wagner did that for over 200 operas. So no wonder, as he's composing, he kind of flits in and out of things that his hand knows how to do. Certain melodic turns of the bel canto or of Bellini or of the French Grand Opera, just even sometimes without him realizing it, seek in. Anyone who is a writer knows that after you read a really good book and you write something immediately after, you sometimes have to give it a little bit of time because you're going to start writing like the book that you just read. Right? Like these influences get into us in very surprising ways. It's also worth noting that Wagner's Dresden library that he compiled later in life is not what you have here. Again, this is what he mentions from his early life, not the library that he would famously put together later. And here are some things that I noticed when looking at these works. And I purposely handed this out to you later in our talk so we weren't distracted throughout. But do take a look as we go through, and I'll take some questions here in a minute. Here are some things that stood out. First of all, what is not there? The Bible or any sacred text, non-existent. Never mentioned. And in fact, the only time he mentions going to church at all is his own wedding, which I have to quickly read an anecdote of because it's just too good to pass up and just gives us such an insight into what he was like. He's describing his wedding with Minna Planner, and he is, we're at the point the wedding vows have been exchanged, and the priest is now giving the homily. I listened as if in a dream to the nuptial address of the parson, who later, I heard, had not been entirely disassociated from the bigotry that had stirred Königsberg in the past. A few days later, I was told of a rumor going about town that I had proceeded legally against the parson for some gross personal insights contained in his sermon. I didn't understand what this was all about, and could only suppose the exaggerated rumor arose from a passage that I had absorbed with some puzzlement. In speaking of the future sufferings which we were to share, meaning the parson is giving his homily and talking about how marriage is sometimes really difficult. Maybe Wagner should have paid more attention. The preacher spoke of a friend whom we both did not know. Anxious to learn more of this benevolent but secret protector who had chosen such an odd way of announcing himself to me, I looked inquiringly up at the parson. Reproachfully and with punitive emphasis, he disclosed to me the name of that unknown friend who would help us on our journey, Jesus. So Wagner's kind of not paying attention to his own wedding homily. Apparently there's this friend who's going to help them, and he's like, who are we talking about? Totally missing the fact that he's talking about faith being at the center of your marriage or whatever it was. I don't know. I find that hilarious, and I find that it gives a really interesting insight to how just uninterested he was in the actual faith of those around him, which then makes Parsifal so interesting, right? The way that he gets those ideas and plays with them, in the spirituality that comes in, that is just so interesting. That was just so not a foundational thing for him in any possible way. What also surprised me is never mentioned in the first part of Mein Leben is any German or Norse myth. Does not exist. Fascinating. He would be kind of drawn into that world slightly later than his 30th birthday. That has real deep ramifications, because as you go through what he talks about as his influences, we see that he is obsessed with Shakespeare. So anyone who has said to you that The Ring is Norse mythology with, some Greek and Shakespeare influences kind of peppered on top, flip it. The Ring is Shakespeare and Schiller and and Greek mythology with some Norse and German myth peppered on top. The chronology of how these ideas came together and what is at the base of what's happening is the Greek, is the Shakespeare, is the Goethe, is the Schiller, etc. That's a whole different way of looking at the Ring. Fricka is not the Norse god with a little bit of Hera peppered on top. She's Hera with some Norse flair, right? With some rams that lead in her carriage. That is just a foundationally different way of thinking about what transpires, and therefore the scene work that happens and the ways that Wagner changes the myth. Sometimes people will read the original Nibelungenlied or read the Welsunger saga and get frustrated. Why did Wagner tell the story the way he did? These stories are great. Because he wasn't interested in telling those stories ultimately. He was interested in the ideas of those stories. He was interested in the Germanness of it all, or the Europeanness of it all. He was interested in all of those things, and very sincerely. But what was at the foundation of his artistic soul? Putting together a good scene, right? These ideas that existed in the earlier works. What is not there is any visual art. He seems kind of uninterested in the visual world around him. Which I think is interesting, especially since he surely saw lots of, paintings and things like that. And for someone who would become the first modern stage director to not really talk about visual influences is interesting. Maybe that's why every single scenic direction he gives is just there's a rocky outcrop, right? His visual imagination seems to not match his dramatic or musical imagination, which I think is interesting with a little bit of editorializing there. What is there, and what is of note, is whenever he says things like, but of course, or as you know, or obviously, and then follows with a piece of art that is unknown to us today. It implies that there were so many things that we don't even know existed that were swirling around the discourse. It's amazing how many operettas and Singspiels and popular tunes and popular pieces that he talks as if, you know exactly what you're talking about. But we have no idea what he's talking about. Some of these pieces don't even exist anymore for public consumption. It just gives this sense of how complete his artistic world was and how many different things go into these pieces. They were not created on desert islands from a kind of person exiled all by himself. He was in this world absorbing all of this, and it can't help but change and influence what he creates. What is there is mostly plays and operas, and he views those things more or less interchangeably, and had a vast, vast knowledge of opera, which I think gives even more credence to his the incredible nature of his innovations. The fact that somebody who is so knowledgeable of the bel canto, of the French grand, of the German romantic, of all of these things, he knew these pieces, as I mentioned, he transcribed them in his own hand, and yet he was able to break through because of his interest in theater. It makes him, I think, even more interesting. We have just a couple minutes remaining, and I do want to turn our attention to some questions that you may have that this talk has prompted, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the influences on music and drama and give you some anecdotes that may help change some of the ways that you think about these things. As I mentioned, drama was a family affair. And they were his first artistic experiences and his first artistic endeavors. In fact, Wagner first started composing seriously when he wanted to write music for a play. It was very popular in the 19th century, as you may or may not know, to write scores for plays, to kind of fill in scene transitions, underscoring, overtures, those kinds of things. Beethoven, famously did this with a couple of things, and he wanted to do that. And he wrote his first play, which unfortunately does not exist, but Wagner describes in great detail in the first part of Mein Leben, and it is this play called Leopold und Adelaide. And this play, to very quickly summarize, is as if Richard III, Hamlet, and the great works of Goethe had a baby and were put on steroids. It is a revenge plot about Leopold, whose father has been murdered, but he's not going to be satisfied by only killing the man who killed his father. No, he must wipe out every single descendant of that family. He must wipe out the family line. And as he's embarking on this giant revenge, he is taken to prison and incarcerated, where he falls in love with a beautiful woman that brings him food, who turns out to be a descendant of the murderer, right? And at the end, just everyone is dead. There are bodies everywhere. His family apparently was really concerned about him. And he talks about that very candidly in the first part of Mein Leben. So the fact that, at the end of the ring, everyone's dead, that was there in Leopold, right? You just see his interest in these high drama, high tragic situations, and it's in creating this play that he chose to start writing music. Again, he was a man of the theater first, not discrediting the brilliance of the music or our connection to it, but that's where he started. It's worth noting that in the kind of semi-professional theater in Bayreuth, they actually have put together a version of this that you can see. I saw it last summer, but unfortunately, or 2 summers ago, but I was pretty jet-lagged and fell asleep. So I can't vouch for it one way or the other, but kind of cool that they put that together. His music is always based in the drama. And Shakespeare, Schiller, and Goethe make up the most part of his named influences, and 1/3 of his stated pantheon. Throughout his life, one of the few things that Wagner said that was consistent is that he had a pantheon of influences, and they were Shakespeare, Mozart, and Beethoven. And the fact that Shakespeare is 1/3 of that, I think, is something that we need to pay very close attention to as we take on his music dramas and beyond. Then finally, on the musical front, according to him, he was largely self-taught, which I think is interesting. The fact that he was kind of, again, this dilettante, this kid who really struggled sitting for piano lessons, who learned mostly by doing, mostly by transcribing, is worth noting. And that opera was the beginning of it all. He was not, while he was greatly influenced by Beethoven's Ninth, while he was greatly influenced with other orchestral works, it was opera that made him love music. The first opera he saw, by the way, was an opera by Graytree, and his kind of great conversion to opera happened, according to him, when he saw Fidelio. So that is one of his foundational pieces, hence why I mentioned it when talking about The Flying Dutchman and how important understanding that work is to understanding what happened later. It's worth noting also Marschner's Der Vampir, The Vampire, is another incredible influence that he had. He worked on multiple productions and has all kinds of influences on Dutchman and his other more Gothic elements of his pieces moving forward. Sorry, this is ringing a little bit. From the very beginning, he had interest in big sounds. He tells a fascinating anecdote when he created a festive overture and had cannons. And it was in a very, very loud hall, kind of like this one. And apparently everyone left. Like, it was just way too loud. And he had to be taken back home, crying by his sister, kind of patting him, saying, there, it's fine. But he was always interested in kind of this ambitious, large scale of emotion and sound. Again, at the end of Leutbold und Adelaide, everyone's dead. Whenever he writes kind of his early musical works, they're massive. Like, he's interested in monumentalism at a very young age. He has engagement in a variety of national styles. We, of course, associate him most fully with the German tradition, but he, when talking about his life, has very few distinctions between what is German, what is Austrian, what is French, what is whatever. What is English? The fact that he's so influenced by Shakespeare is of note. He's not only dealing with German writers, he's not being ethnocentric in that way, which is interesting. And he's interested in a variety of genres. He talks about liking popular tunes in beer halls. He talks about being interested in popular song and in little dance pieces, that he didn't take his art so seriously so soon and allowed those things to be influential to him. He often copied others before embarking on his own ideas. When you listen to his earliest sonatas, when you listen to his earliest operas, you hear very clear influences, which again, being influenced by others, he then would keep the ball rolling and break out of that conventionality. And I have to just mention that two of the best examples of this are Das Liebesverbot and his Columbus Overture. And I actually want to take a quick moment and listen to the first 30 seconds of the Das Liebesverbot overture, because it's one of the more fascinating things that we can listen to. And my guess is, if I didn't say who wrote this or where it comes from, we would never even guess that this was Wagner at all. Anyways, it goes on from there. If I'd played that, my guess is some of you would have said, is that Gilbert and Sullivan? And some of you would have said, is that Offenbach? Right? And it's just, we don't associate that sound with him at all. And yet he wrote it, right? And yet this is where we start, that then gets to the distilled, incredible majesty of the later pieces. Again, I'm not saying that early Wagner is all brilliant. In fact, I'm saying kind of the opposite. But I am saying that it's all interesting, and that it is all important for understanding how you go from point A to point B, how you go from that exuberant, over-the-top, giant beginning of Delacroix's career to the distilled image at the end. What is that human arc? What is the chronology that built a person filled with contradictions, filled with difficulty, filled with blind spots, and filled with ideas that even didn't make sense to himself? And I think that that is at the heart of why Wagner is so interesting to this day. And if you take anything away from our time together, I hope it's that you're kind of now curious to dive into some of those earlier pieces that maybe your own learning or own listening you haven't been curious in. I come across many audience members, who love the late pieces, but even Tannhäuser or Lohengrin kind of not their favorite. Like, go listen to those. Like, go listen to all of it, because it's all important in telling the human journey. And I think moving forward with Wagner scholarship, and as fans and advocates for this music and drama, dealing with the human is at the heart of what we need to do moving forward. With the couple minutes we have remaining, any questions? Yes, sir.
Did Wagner just read Shakespeare, or did he actually go to Shakespeare plays? And if he did he see it in English?
Great question. Did he, Wagner, I'm going to repeat back questions for those of you on the stream and those of you in the room. When it comes to Shakespeare, did he just read Shakespeare, or did he perform in it, or see it, or read it in the original English? He saw lots of these plays. I don't know if he was ever in a Shakespeare play. I'd have to go back and see what he says about it. But he certainly was around performances of these things. He certainly read them in German. He actually talks, there's a very sad anecdote in it. He talks about trying to learn English in order to read Shakespeare, and he just can't do it. Wagner had a hard time with languages. He had a hard time with French, very self-admittedly, had a hard time with English. He was kind of a one-language man despite his best efforts. I see Peter standing here, so I think we're nearing time. But if you do have any further questions, we're going to stick around for a couple minutes, happy to answer them. And again, I hope this has been an interesting discussion, delving into a part of this artist that, again, is afforded to every other artist, and I think Wagner is equally deserving of us looking at his early life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We really appreciate your erudition and your insights in this. One of my favorite parts of mein Leben is the discussion of his failings in writing Leopold. That he got to the end of Act 4 and so many characters were dead. He had to bring them back as ghosts in order to write Act 5. We have an entire repast laid out for everybody out in the foyer, and I hope that you'll join Professor Borths and us all in having a good time together. Thank you all for coming.